You think you know history? You don't. Somewhere right now, in a drawer, in a museum basement, in a hole in the ground, something is sitting that shouldn't be there. Something that's been dated, tested, argued over, and never explained. Not by accident, not by fraud. Just unexplained. 10 cases. Real ones. No myths, no guesses dressed up as facts. Just the moments when the experts looked at the evidence and had nothing to say. We're not here to tell you what it means. We're here to show you what's been found. Let's get into it. Northern Germany is not a place people associate with ancient violence. It's a landscape of slow rivers, quiet farmland, and small towns that have changed little in generations. The Tollense River winds through this region without hurry, shallow and unremarkable, the kind of waterway you might cross without a second thought. But beneath its banks lies one of the most disturbing archaeological discoveries in European history, a site that has forced historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about life in the Bronze Age. It began, as these things often do, with a single bone. In 1996, an amateur archaeologist noticed a fragment of a human arm protruding from the riverbank, along with a flint arrowhead still lodged inside it. It seemed, at first, like an isolated find, perhaps a lone death, an accident, or a burial disturbed by centuries of water erosion. Nobody expected what would come next. Over the following 2 decades, systematic excavations revealed something far larger. Along a stretch of riverbed roughly 3 kilometers long, archaeologists uncovered the skeletal remains of over 150 individuals, and estimates based on further surveys suggest the true number could be well over 1,000. Alongside the bones, bronze weapons, wooden clubs, horse remains, and evidence of blunt force trauma on an almost industrial scale. This wasn't a burial site. It was a battlefield. And it dates back roughly 3,300 years, to around 1250 BC. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what historians believed about this period before Tollense was found. The prevailing view of Bronze Age Northern Europe was one of scattered, loosely organized communities, small tribal groups engaged in occasional, low-intensity conflict. Raiding, perhaps. Cattle theft. Skirmishes involving a few dozen men at most. The idea of large, coordinated armies clashing in open battle belonged to the Mediterranean world, to Egypt, to Mycenae, to the early kingdoms of the Near East. Northern Europe, by comparison, was assumed to be too fragmented, too underdeveloped to produce anything resembling organized warfare on a mass scale. Tollense shattered that assumption. The evidence at the site suggests a battle involving somewhere between 750 and 2,000 combatants, a staggering number for this period and region. Isotope analysis of the bones revealed something even stranger. Many of the dead were not local. Their chemical signatures, traces left in tooth enamel and bone from the food and water consumed during childhood, pointed to origins hundreds of kilometers away in southern Germany, or possibly even farther. Which raises the first uncomfortable question. How do you move an army of 1,000 or more men across hundreds of kilometers of Bronze Age terrain, feed them, arm them, and organize them into a coordinated fighting force? In a period when most of Northern Europe supposedly lacked the political structures to do exactly that? Someone had to plan this. Someone had to have authority, the kind of authority capable of raising, provisioning, and moving a small army. But no fortresses, palaces, or major settlements of the scale you'd expect to support that kind of power have been found anywhere near the site. Whoever organized this battle left behind no capital, no throne room, no written record of who they were or why they fought. That absence is, in its own way, as strange as the battlefield itself. The wounds tell their own story. Skulls fractured by blunt weapons, arrowheads embedded in bone, some clearly fired from a distance, others suggesting close, brutal combat. Healed fractures on some skeletons hint that a number of the dead may have been experienced fighters, men who had survived previous violence before meeting their end here. Researchers have also identified what appear to be wooden clubs shaped with a precision that suggests specialized weapon making. Not improvised farm tools grabbed in a moment of panic, but objects built for the specific purpose of killing. And then there are the horses. Remains of at least 5 horses have been recovered from the site, along with wooden and bone artifacts interpreted by some researchers as possible harness or riding equipment. If accurate, this would place mounted warriors, or at least mounted logistics, in northern Europe centuries before such capability was widely assumed to exist there. Here, the mainstream picture starts to blur into something more uncertain. Who were these people? Why did they converge on this particular stretch of river, in this particular valley, to fight and die in such staggering numbers? Some researchers propose a control of trade routes theory. The Tollense River may have sat along a significant north-south corridor, a natural highway for the movement of goods, including the tin and bronze that define the era's economy and its weapons of war. A conflict over control of that route, they argue, would explain both the scale of the battle and the presence of fighters from distant regions competing for a valuable strategic corridor. Others have suggested something closer to a large-scale raid gone catastrophically wrong, an invading force meeting fierce, organized local resistance, resulting in a battle far bloodier and more prolonged than either side anticipated. Still others push further into speculative territory, pointing to the sheer number of dead and asking whether the Tollense find might represent not a single battle, but the layered remains of repeated conflicts at the same crossing point over years or even generations. A valley that, for reasons not fully understood, kept drawing armed groups back to the same lethal stretch of river. None of these explanations are proven. Each accounts for some of the evidence while leaving other questions untouched. What deepens the mystery further is what's missing. Despite the scale of the discovery, we still don't know the names of the peoples who fought here, what language they spoke, what they called themselves, or what specifically triggered the violence. There are no accompanying inscriptions. Writing had not yet reached this part of Europe. There are no oral histories, no later legends clearly traceable back to this event, even though a battle of this size must have echoed through the communities that lost their sons, brothers, and fathers on that riverbank. A conflict this large, in a period this poorly documented, simply vanished from memory. Whatever stories were told about the Tollense battle in the centuries after it happened, they didn't survive. The event was significant enough to leave physical scars on the landscape and on hundreds of human bodies, yet insignificant enough, in the eyes of history, to leave nothing else behind. Excavations at Tollense are ongoing. Each season, researchers recover more remains, more weapons, more fragments of a story that refuses to come fully into focus. Some archaeologists believe the site may still hold thousands more skeletal remains, scattered along stretches of riverbed not yet surveyed. If that's true, the numbers already considered staggering could grow substantially, and with them, the scale of whatever event took place here. For now, the Tollense Valley remains a battlefield without a name attached to it, a war without a known cause, and a body count that continues to rise the longer researchers look. It stands as a quiet reminder that written history is not the same as complete history, that entire conflicts, entire mobilized peoples, entire moments of large-scale organized violence can simply disappear from the record, waiting only for a chance discovery on a riverbank to bring them back into view. Somewhere beneath that slow-moving water, more of the story is still buried. The question is whether we'll ever recover enough of it to understand what really happened here, or whether the Tollense Valley will keep its combatants and their reasons for fighting buried for good. If the Tollense Valley teaches us that history can vanish into silence, the Altai Mountains teach us the opposite lesson, that sometimes, against all odds, history refuses to disappear at all. Far to the east, where Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan meet in a remote tangle of peaks and high plateaus, the Altai Range rises into some of the most inhospitable terrain in Central Asia. Winters here are brutal. Summers are short. For most of the year, the ground itself is frozen solid, locked beneath a permanent layer of subsurface ice known as permafrost. It is not a place that welcomes visitors, and for over 2,000 years, it kept a secret almost perfectly. Scattered across this high, unforgiving landscape are dozens of burial mounds known as kurgans. large earthen and stone structures raised over underground burial chambers. To the untrained eye, they might look like nothing more than unusual hills, gentle swellings in an otherwise rugged terrain. But beneath several of these mounds, archaeologists would find something almost without precedent: bodies, clothing, and artifacts preserved not as fragments or residue, but as if their owners had been laid to rest only recently. The people responsible for these tombs were the Scythians, or more precisely, a related nomadic culture archaeologists call the Pazyryk, named after the valley where their burial sites were first seriously studied. The Scythians were horse-mounted nomads who dominated the vast steppe lands stretching from the Black Sea to Mongolia during the first millennium BC. Ancient Greek writers, including Herodotus, described them as fierce warriors, skilled riders, and a people whose customs seem both alien and fascinating to Mediterranean observers. For centuries, much of what we knew about them came from these second-hand accounts, the impressions of outsiders looking in. The Pazyryk tombs changed that. They gave the Scythians back their own voice, preserved not in words but in wool, fur, flesh, and ink. The first major excavations began in the 1920s, but it was the work of Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko in the late 1940s that revealed the full scope of what lay hidden beneath the Altai soil. What Rudenko and his team discovered defied ordinary expectations of archaeological preservation. Here is how it happened. When a burial chamber was originally constructed and sealed, water would seep into the timber-lined tomb. Combined with the extreme cold of the region, that water would freeze. And because the mounds were built with such mass and insulation, the ice inside never fully melted, even during the height of summer. Over the following 2,000 years, the tombs effectively became natural freezers, sealed beneath stone and earth, locked in a state of permanent winter. The result was a form of preservation archaeologists rarely encounter. Bodies were found with skin, hair, and even tattoos still intact. Textiles retained their color. Wooden objects, leather goods, and felt carvings survived essentially undamaged. It was, in the words of many who studied the site, less like an excavation and more like opening a door into a moment frozen in time. Consider the most famous of these burials, a woman discovered in one of the Pazyryk-related sites, later nicknamed the Ice Maiden, or the Siberian Ice Maiden, by the press, though her formal designation among researchers is the Ukok Princess, after the plateau where she was found in 1993. She had been buried with striking ceremony, laid in a hollowed larchwood coffin, dressed in a silk blouse, a wool skirt, and a tall headdress, surrounded by offerings of food, dishes, and 6 horses fully saddled and bridled, positioned as if to carry her onward into whatever awaited beyond. Her body, remarkably, still bore visible tattoos, intricate depictions of deer and mythical creatures inked into her preserved skin, images so detailed that researchers could study the artistic style of a culture that left behind no written language. She was around 25 years old at the time of death, and analysis suggested she had likely died from breast cancer, possibly worsened by a fall from a horse. But it wasn't just the state of her preservation that captured attention. It was the questions her burial raised. Why would a nomadic culture invest this level of ceremony, artistry, and resource into the burial of a young woman? Later research proposed she may have held a significant social or spiritual role, perhaps a healer, a storyteller, or a figure of ritual importance within her community. To local indigenous groups in the Altai region, her discovery held even deeper meaning. Many considered her a guardian spirit, and her excavations sparked genuine controversy, with some communities attributing subsequent natural disasters in the region to the disturbance of her resting place. Years later, following public pressure, her remains were returned to the Republic of Altai and reburied near the site of her original discovery, a rare instance of a modern community asserting a direct living connection to a burial site over 2,000 years old. But the Ukok Princess was only one discovery among many. Other Pazyryk tombs revealed the bodies of high-status men, their skin marked with elaborate tattoos depicting griffins, deer, and other creatures rendered with a level of artistic sophistication that continues to surprise researchers studying nomadic art of this period. These weren't crude markings. They were carefully composed, stylistically consistent designs, evidence of an artistic tradition passed down and refined over generations, among a people once dismissed as simple wanderers of the steppe. And then there are the objects. Among the most extraordinary finds recovered from the Pazyryk kurgans is what many scholars consider the oldest known pile carpet in the world, the Pazyryk carpet, dated to roughly the 5th century BC. Woven with a density and complexity that would be difficult to replicate even with modern techniques, the carpet depicts rows of griffins, deer, and mounted riders in vivid, still visible color. Its craftsmanship is so advanced that some researchers have questioned how a nomadic culture, without fixed cities or the kind of settled infrastructure typically associated with large-scale textile production, could have produced something of this quality and complexity. That question sits at the heart of what makes Pazyryk such a compelling mystery. Nomadic cultures are often imagined almost by default as culturally simple, mobile, practical, focused on survival rather than art or ceremony. The Pazyryk finds argue otherwise. These were people who transported elaborate wooden furniture across mountain passes. People who preserved and prepared the bodies of their dead through processes resembling embalming, removing internal organs and packing bodies with herbs to slow decomposition, a level of ritual preparation that implies deep, structured beliefs about death and what follows it. People who imported goods from remarkably distant regions. Chinese silk and mirrors have been recovered from Pazyryk tombs, alongside textiles believed to originate from as far away as Persia or India. Which raises an uncomfortable question for those who like their historical categories tidy. How do you explain a culture that was mobile enough to leave behind no permanent cities, yet sophisticated enough to command trade networks stretching thousands of kilometers in every direction? Mainstream archaeology offers a fairly grounded answer. The Scythians and related Pazyryk peoples were master horsemen who controlled key overland trade routes. Precursors, in some ways, to what would later become the Silk Road. Their wealth came not from settled agriculture or permanent cities, but from mobility itself, controlling passage, trading horses, furs, and other steppe goods for luxury items produced by settled civilizations to their east, south, and west. Their elaborate burials in this view reflect not contradiction, but strategy. A people who invested their wealth not in architecture, which a nomadic lifestyle couldn't support, but in portable art, ceremonial objects, and richly furnished tombs meant to honor their dead and, perhaps, to display status in the one place status could permanently endure. It's a reasonable explanation, but it doesn't fully account for everything found within the frozen chambers of the Altai. Some researchers have pointed to the presence of cannabis seeds and small charred braziers found within several tombs, suggesting ritual use of the plant, potentially for religious or funerary ceremonies, a detail that aligns with Herodotus's own ancient descriptions of Scythian purification rituals involving heated stones and inhaled vapor. If accurate, it would mean these accounts, once treated as exaggerated or unreliable secondhand reporting, may have preserved a genuine cultural practice, raising the question of how much else in ancient outsider accounts of the Scythians, long dismissed as embellishment, might in fact be quietly, physically true. Others have focused on the tattooed imagery itself, noting recurring motifs of animal combat and transformation, creatures blending features of predator and prey, or shifting between recognizable animal forms and something more abstract. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of shamanistic belief systems, in which such imagery may have represented spiritual journeys, transformation between worlds, or protection for the deceased during their passage into the afterlife. Whether this reflects organized religious practice, personal spiritual belief, or something else entirely remains genuinely unresolved. The Pazyryk left behind no text to explain their own symbolism to us. And there's a quieter mystery too, one easy to overlook amid the more visually striking finds. The sheer consistency of burial practice across the Pazyryk sites, the orientation of bodies, the presence of sacrificed horses, the specific styles of tattooing, the construction of timber burial chambers, suggests a shared cultural framework spanning a wide geographic area, and in some cases, centuries of time. For a mobile people without cities, without, as far as we know, a written language, how was this level of cultural consistency maintained and transmitted across such vast distances and generations? Oral tradition alone seems almost insufficient to explain it, yet no better explanation has definitively emerged. Climate itself now threatens to complicate the story further. The very permafrost that preserved these tombs for over 2 millennia is increasingly unstable, affected by shifting regional climate patterns. Some kurgans excavated in recent decades have already shown signs of partial thawing before researchers could reach them, with organic material beginning to degrade upon exposure. It raises a sobering possibility that other Pazyryk tombs, not yet discovered, may be quietly decomposing beneath the Altai soil right now, their contents deteriorating before any archaeologist has the chance to study them. Mysteries dissolving before they can even be asked. How many more tattooed bodies, sealed carpets, and untranslatable symbols remain locked in the frozen ground of the Altai, waiting either for careful excavation or slow, silent loss to the thaw? The Pazyryk tombs gave us an unprecedented window into a culture that history had largely reduced to secondhand rumor and battlefield reputation. They showed us artists, ritualists, traders, and mourners, people whose inner world was every bit as rich and complex as any settled civilization of their time. But a window is not a door. We can see into their world through ice and preserved skin and woven wool, yet we still don't fully understand the beliefs, the social structures, or the specific meanings behind so much of what they left behind. The ice kept its secrets for 2,000 years. The question now is how much longer it can, and how much of that story might slip away, unread, before we ever get the chance to ask it what it knows. If the Altai Mountains preserved a culture through ice, the wetlands of eastern England preserved one through something far more unassuming: mud. In the flat, drained fen country of Cambridgeshire, in a working quarry surrounded by the low hum of industrial machinery, archaeologists uncovered what would come to be described as Britain's own version of Pompeii. Not because of volcanic ash, and not because of sudden violence on a grand scale, but because of fire, water, and an extraordinary accident of preservation that froze an ordinary moment in time so completely that researchers could reconstruct not just how Bronze Age people lived, but almost precisely what they were doing on the day their world ended. The site is known as Must Farm, and what makes it remarkable isn't scale. It isn't the number of the dead or the size of the structure involved. It's the sheer, almost uncomfortable intimacy of what was found. The story begins around 3,000 years ago, near the end of the Bronze Age, when a small settlement of wooden roundhouses was built on stilts above a slow-moving river channel. This wasn't unusual for the period. Pile-dwelling settlements existed elsewhere in prehistoric Europe. But what happened to this particular settlement was, at some point, likely within less than a year of its construction, the settlement caught fire. The blaze spread quickly through the timber and thatch structures, and as the buildings burned, they collapsed downward into the shallow river below. The wet mud and silt of the riverbed then did something remarkable. It sealed the wreckage almost immediately, cutting off the oxygen that would normally allow organic material to decay. Encased in waterlogged sediment for 3 millennia, the remains of Must Farm didn't just survive. They were preserved in a state of detail archaeologists rarely, if ever, encounter from this period anywhere in the world. When excavations began in earnest between 2015 and 2016, led by Cambridge Archaeological Unit researchers, what emerged from the mud left even experienced archaeologists visibly stunned. Textiles survived, not fragments, but woven fabrics made from plant fibers, so finely made that researchers could study individual thread counts and weaving techniques. Wooden buckets were found still upright, some with the remains of what appeared to be their last contents inside. Bowls of half-eaten porridge made from wheat and barley sat where they had been left, spoons resting nearby as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment 3,000 years ago and never returned. One pot preserved a meal that included animal fats and grains, so intact that researchers could describe not just what was eaten in this settlement, but how it was likely prepared and seasoned. There is something almost unsettling about that level of preservation. Most archaeology reconstructs the past from fragments, a few post holes, some pottery shards, the outline of a wall. Must Farm didn't require reconstruction. It required something closer to careful, patient excavation of a scene that had simply been paused mid-motion. The settlement itself, researchers determined, consisted of several circular wooden houses built on a raised platform above the water, connected to the surrounding land by a palisade, a defensive fence-like structure encircling the site. Textiles recovered included some of the finest prehistoric fabric ever found in Britain, woven from plant fibers with a level of skill that challenged assumptions about the technical sophistication of late Bronze Age domestic life. Glass beads, likely imported from continental Europe, pointed to trade networks stretching well beyond the local fens. Bronze tools, some still fitted with their original wooden handles, were recovered essentially intact. Spearheads, sickles, and axes that had clearly been used, sharpened, and cared for, not simply manufactured and stored. And then there were the wheels. Among the artifacts recovered was a complete wooden wheel, still fitted with its axle, believed to be one of the oldest and most complete examples of wheeled transport technology ever found in Britain. Its presence at a site built on stilts above a river channel raises an interesting, quietly nagging question. What was a wheel, an object associated with overland travel, doing at a settlement seemingly organized around water? This is where Must Farm shifts from remarkable preservation into something closer to genuine mystery. The mainstream interpretation holds that the settlement's inhabitants likely used both land and water routes depending on season, need, and destination. The wheel representing evidence of broader mobility and trade connections extending beyond the immediate wetland environment. It's a reasonable, well-supported explanation, but it also reveals how much researchers are still working to understand about the relationship between this settlement and the wider world surrounding it. Because Must Farm doesn't answer every question it raises, it answers some, and in doing so, exposes others. Consider the fire itself. Archaeologists have been able to determine, through careful analysis of the burn patterns and structural collapse, that the fire spread rapidly, likely too rapidly for it to have started accidentally in a single location and gradually consumed the settlement over time. Some researchers have proposed the fire may have started in more than one structure simultaneously, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Was this an accident, or was it deliberate? The evidence doesn't clearly point in either direction. There are no obvious signs of a violent struggle, no weapons embedded in human remains, no clear indication of an attack. Human remains were recovered from the site, but in relatively small numbers, and there's no definitive evidence suggesting the inhabitants died in the fire itself. It's possible, even likely, that most escaped. And yet the fire's speed and pattern continue to invite quiet speculation. Was this the result of an accidental blaze that got catastrophically out of control? A deliberate act of destruction, perhaps by outside attackers, or even by the settlement's own inhabitants for reasons lost to time? Or something else entirely? A controlled event whose true purpose we simply don't have the context to understand. What makes this question so difficult to resolve is the abandonment pattern itself. In most cases of ancient settlement destruction, sites show evidence of salvage, survivors returning afterward to recover valuable tools, materials, or possessions. At Must Farm, that didn't happen. Bronze tools, valuable and clearly well maintained before the fire, were left where they fell. Textiles, glass beads, complete pottery vessels, all abandoned, all left to sink into the mud rather than recovered. Why would a community, particularly one demonstrably skilled, resourced, and connected to distant trade networks, walk away from so much of clear material value without returning to reclaim it? One explanation is straightforward. Perhaps the destruction was so sudden and the structural collapse into the water so immediate that recovery was physically impossible in the moment, and by the time conditions might have allowed a return, the site had already begun sinking into mud and silt too deep to easily access. Another, more unsettling possibility raised by some researchers is that the abandonment wasn't about physical inability at all, but something closer to reluctance. A decision, conscious or otherwise, not to return to a place associated with catastrophe or loss. We don't know which explanation is correct. Possibly neither is. Entirely. There's also the matter of what Must Farm reveals about a period of prehistory long assumed to be culturally modest. Like the Pazyryk tomb's shattered assumptions about nomadic sophistication, Must Farm has quietly dismantled outdated assumptions about late Bronze Age Britain. This was not, as older textbooks might suggest, a society of simple subsistence farmers scraping by in isolated communities. The people of Must Farm wore finely woven clothing. They cooked complex meals using imported and local ingredients. They maintained trade connections stretching across the sea to continental Europe. They built architecturally deliberate structures on a raised platform requiring genuine engineering knowledge to construct and maintain above moving water. This raises a broader, quieter question that extends beyond Must Farm itself. How many other Bronze Age communities across Britain and Europe possessed a similar level of sophistication, connectivity, and daily complexity? Evidence that simply didn't survive because they weren't fortunate enough to burn down over water and sink into oxygen-free mud? Must Farm may not be an exception in terms of how people lived during this period. It may simply be an exception in terms of what survived to tell us about it. Which means our broader understanding of Bronze Age Britain, built largely from scattered post holes, isolated artifacts, and educated inference, may be missing entire dimensions of daily life and cultural complexity that only a site like this could reveal. There's a particular kind of unease in that thought. Archaeology, by necessity, builds its picture of the past from what survives. But survival is often a matter of accident rather than significance. Must Farm didn't survive because it was uniquely important among Bronze Age settlements. It survived because of a fire, a collapse, and a bed of oxygen-starved mud that happened to seal it away at precisely the right moment. Somewhere beneath the fens of England, and beneath countless other landscapes around the world, similar moments of ordinary, unremarkable daily life may be sitting fully preserved, waiting for the right combination of accident and discovery to bring them back into view. Or may already be lost, decayed long ago under conditions less forgiving than the mud of Cambridgeshire. Excavation at Must Farm has concluded, but analysis of what was recovered continues, with researchers still working through the sheer volume of material pulled from the site. A process expected to yield new findings and new questions for years to come. Each new piece of woven fabric, each tool, each preserved meal, adds another fragment to our understanding of these people's lives. But the central questions: what caused the fire? Why nothing was reclaimed? And what larger world these people were truly connected to, remain unresolved. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Must Farm isn't what was found, but what it implies about everything we haven't found. A meal left half-eaten, tools left exactly where they fell, a wheel resting beside a settlement built for water, fragments of a single ordinary day in the life of a community, a day that, for reasons still unclear, became their last. What were they running from? Or was there nothing to run from at all? Just fire, water, and time, conspiring together to seal an ordinary moment so completely that 3,000 years later, we're still trying to understand exactly what we're looking at. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over burial mounds. Not emptiness, exactly, but the sense of something deliberately withheld. Standing among the grass-covered mounds of Sutton, overlooking the River Deben in Suffolk, that silence feels especially heavy. Unlike Must Farm, nothing here burned in a sudden accident. Nothing was frozen by chance encounter with ice or mud. What lies beneath these low, unassuming hills was placed there on purpose, with extraordinary care, by people who wanted it to remain hidden, and who very nearly succeeded. By the late 1930s, the mounds at Sutton Hoo had sat largely undisturbed for well over 1,000 years, quietly ignored as unremarkable bumps in a Suffolk field. Local legend suggested treasure might be buried beneath them, but such rumors surrounded countless ancient earthworks across Britain, and few took them seriously. That changed in 1939, when landowner Edith Priddy commissioned local archaeologist Basil Brown to investigate the largest of the mounds on her estate. What Brown uncovered, working carefully through the sandy Suffolk soil, would go on to be described as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in British history, and one that arrived at a strange, almost cruelly timed moment. As Brown and his small team painstakingly revealed the outline of an enormous ship buried beneath the mound, Europe stood on the edge of war. Within weeks of the excavation's most important findings, Britain would declare war on Germany, and the treasures of Sutton Hoo would be hastily documented, packed away, and hidden for safekeeping, their full significance not properly studied and displayed until years after the conflict had ended. The ship itself was staggering in scale. Nearly 27 meters long, it had been dragged from the river, hauled uphill, and lowered into a carefully prepared trench before being covered with an earthen mound. The wood of the vessel had long since rotted away, leaving behind only its ghostly imprint in the sand, a phenomenon archaeologists call a sand shadow. Brown's team had to work with extraordinary delicacy, mapping the shape and structure of a ship that existed physically almost entirely as negative space. At the center of the ship, within a wooden burial chamber, lay the remains of what was almost certainly a king. That word, almost, carries real weight here, because the identity of the person buried at Sutton Hoo remains, even now, a matter of scholarly debate rather than settled fact. The acidic Suffolk soil had long since dissolved any trace of human remains, leaving no skeleton, no physical body to examine. What survived instead was the burial's contents. And those contents told a story of staggering wealth and status. Among the artifacts recovered, an ornate iron helmet, its face mask cast in a haunting, stylized expression that has since become one of the most recognizable images in British archaeology. A ceremonial shield decorated with intricate metalwork, a sword with a gold and garnet inlaid hilt, silver bowls imported from the Byzantine Empire, thousands of kilometers to the southeast, gold coins from Merovingian Francia, useful for dating the burial to sometime in the early 7th century. A great gold belt buckle, weighing nearly half a kilogram, decorated with intertwining serpents and beasts in a style distinct to early Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship. Taken together, the burial represented one of the richest troves of early medieval material ever found in Northern Europe, comparable, some historians argued, to a king's ransom. Which brings us to the central, still unresolved question of Sutton Hoo. Who was buried here? The leading theory points to Raedwald, king of East Anglia, who died around 624 or 625 AD, and was, according to historical sources including the writings of the Venerable Bede, one of the most powerful rulers in England during this period, recognized, at least for a time, as overlord among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The date range fits. The scale and wealth of the burial fits a figure of significant regional power. And East Anglia, notably, was among the last Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to formally convert to Christianity, which may help explain a detail that has puzzled historians for decades. The burial follows clearly pagan customs, complete with grave goods meant to accompany the deceased into an afterlife, and yet 2 small silver spoons found among the treasure-bear Christian inscriptions. That single detail opens a genuinely fascinating window into a moment of profound cultural transition. Here, potentially, is a ruler caught between 2 belief systems, publicly navigating a rapidly Christianizing political landscape while privately, or perhaps ceremonially, still honored according to older pagan traditions upon his death. Was this evidence of Redwald's own documented religious ambivalence, historically described as maintaining both pagan and Christian practices simultaneously? Or does it suggest something more complex about how burial practices themselves were negotiated during a period of genuine religious upheaval? Royal families straddling old and new worlds, hedging their allegiances even in death. We don't know for certain. No inscription within the burial identifies its occupant by name. No contemporary account explicitly describes this specific burial taking place. The connection to Redwald, while compelling and widely accepted among historians, remains an informed inference rather than a documented certainty. And that uncertainty deepens considerably when you consider what else is missing from the burial chamber: a body. Early excavators noted something curious about the burial chamber's chemistry. Phosphate analysis of the soil where a body would have been placed suggested that human remains had, in fact, once been present, but had been completely dissolved by the acidic sand over the centuries, leaving no bone, no tooth, no physical trace behind. This explanation accounts for the absence in purely chemical terms, but it hasn't entirely quieted a separate, more speculative question that resurfaces periodically in discussions of the site. Was this always intended as a body burial, or could it have been, at least in part, a cenotaph? A memorial burial without a physical body, perhaps for a king who died or was lost elsewhere, honored here through possessions rather than physical remains? Most archaeologists favor the straightforward chemical explanation, but the absence of any surviving skeletal material, however well accounted for, still leaves this particular burial slightly more open-ended than most. The mystery deepens further when you look beyond the ship burial itself, to the other mounds scattered across the Sutton site. Not every burial here contained lavish royal treasure. Some contained far more troubling evidence. Archaeologists excavating the wider site identified a group of burials clustered around one particular mound, containing the remains of individuals who appeared to have died violently. Some with evidence of hanging, others showing signs consistent with execution. Radiocarbon dating placed these burials significantly later than the main ship burial, suggesting that at some point after Sutton's royal use had ended, the site was repurposed as a place of execution and punishment. Why here? Why would a site once dedicated to the ceremonial burial of a powerful king later become associated with execution and disgrace? Some historians propose that ancient burial mounds, viewed by later Anglo-Saxon communities as ominous or otherworldly places already associated with the dead, may have been deliberately chosen as execution sites, locations meant to deny the condemned a proper Christian burial by association with older pagan ground. It's a theory that fits the broader pattern found at other Anglo-Saxon sites, where ancient earthworks were sometimes repurposed in similarly grim ways. But it also means that Sutton's story doesn't end with a single king's burial. Long after Redwald, if it was indeed Redwald, was laid to rest with his ship and his treasures, this ground continued to hold meaning, a darker, more punitive meaning, for generations that followed. There's something worth sitting with in that layered history. We tend to think of archaeological sites as capturing a single moment, a single culture, a single story. Sutton resists that simplicity. It is instead a palimpsest, a place written over multiple times by different generations for entirely different purposes, its meaning shifting from royal ceremony to something closer to punishment and disgrace, all within the same patch of Suffolk earth. And there remains, even now, the question of what hasn't yet been found. Sutton comprises around 20 burial mounds in total, and not all of them have been fully excavated using modern archaeological techniques. Early 20th century excavation, however careful for its time, lacked the precision tools and methods available to archaeologists today. Some smaller mounds were looted centuries before Basil Brown ever arrived, their original contents lost to history entirely. Others remain relatively unexplored, their contents still, quite literally, buried questions waiting for future researchers. What might those remaining mounds still hold? Other burials, potentially of other significant figures from early Anglo-Saxon East Anglia? Further evidence that might finally, conclusively confirm or challenge the identification of the ship burial's occupant. Or simply more fragments of a broader story about a kingdom, a dynasty, and a moment of profound cultural transformation that we're still working to fully understand 13 centuries later. Sutton Hoo gave England something it had never quite possessed before its discovery. Tangible, physical proof that early Anglo-Saxon society, often dismissed in earlier historical narratives as a comparatively crude, culturally impoverished period sandwiched between Roman Britain and the Norman conquest, was in fact capable of extraordinary craftsmanship, wide-reaching trade connections, and genuine political sophistication. The so-called Dark Ages, at least in this one Suffolk field, turned out to be considerably less dark than long assumed. But for all it revealed, Sutton Hoo has never fully given up its central secret. We have the ship. We have the treasure. We have a leading, well-reasoned theory about whose burial this was meant to honor. What we don't have is certainty, a name confirmed beyond doubt, a body to examine, a contemporary account that settles the question definitively, once and for all. Perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. A king, if that's truly what he was, who navigated two competing worlds in life, pagan and Christian, old ways and new, buried in a manner that similarly resists easy categorization in death. A ship prepared for a voyage that, over 1,000 years later, we're still trying to fully understand the purpose and destination of. Somewhere among the unexcavated mounds still resting quietly in that Suffolk field, more of this story may yet be waiting. The question is simply whether we'll ever uncover enough to finally know, with certainty, who this remarkable burial was truly meant for. Or whether Sutton Hoo, like the ship itself, will remain defined as much by what has vanished as by what remains. If Sutton Hoo taught us that a burial can be a puzzle even when its contents are extraordinary, the olive groves of southwestern Greece were about to teach archaeologists a similar lesson, that sometimes the most significant discoveries hide in plain sight, in places already assumed to have given up everything they had to offer. Near the ancient site of Pylos, on Greece's Peloponnese Peninsula, archaeologists had been working for decades. This was, after all, familiar territory. Pylos was already famous in the archaeological world, home to the ruins of the so-called Palace of Nestor, a Mycenaean-era complex linked in legend to the wise king mentioned in Homer's Iliad. The palace itself had been excavated back in the 1930s, its administrative archives of linear B tablets already studied, its layout already mapped. By the early 2010s, the general assumption was that this corner of Greece had largely told archaeologists what it had to tell. Then, in the spring of 2015, in an olive grove just a short distance from the palace ruins, a team led by archaeologists Sharon Stocker and Jack Davis began investigating a series of stones that seemed, at first, unremarkable. Possibly just agricultural debris, or the remnants of a collapsed structure. What they found beneath those stones would upend that assumption entirely, and go on to be recognized as one of the most significant Bronze Age discoveries in Greece in over half a century. Beneath the surface lay an intact shaft grave, undisturbed by looters for more than 3,500 years, an almost unheard-of stroke of preservation for a region that had been continuously inhabited, farmed, and excavated for millennia. Inside, the team found the remains of a man, roughly 30 to 35 years old at the time of his death, who came to be known as the Griffin Warrior, named for one of the most striking objects buried alongside him, an ivory plaque carved with the image of a griffin, a mythical creature blending lion and eagle. But the griffin plaque was only the beginning. Over the following months of careful excavation, researchers uncovered more than 1,400 objects buried with this single individual, an extraordinary volume of wealth for what appeared to be an individual grave rather than a grand royal tomb. Bronze weapons, including a long sword and a dagger, both finely crafted. Gold rings, some depicting intricate mythological and ceremonial scenes. Silver cups, ivory combs, thousands of beads made from precious stones including carnelian, amethyst, and amber, the latter likely imported from as far away as the Baltic region, thousands of kilometers to the north. The sheer quantity of material was staggering enough, but it was the quality and sophistication of specific objects that truly stunned researchers and reopened questions that historians had considered largely settled. Chief among these was a small object, barely 4 centimeters across, that would come to be known as the Pylos combat agate. At first, when it was recovered from the grave still coated in centuries of built-up mineral deposits, researchers assumed it was a relatively simple carved gemstone. A nice piece, certainly, but not necessarily exceptional by the standards of Mycenaean-era craftsmanship already familiar to archaeologists. It took roughly a year of careful, painstaking cleaning and conservation before the true nature of the object became clear. Under magnification, the agate revealed an impossibly detailed combat scene. 2 warriors locked in battle, a third already fallen at their feet. Every anatomical detail, every weapon, every fold of clothing, rendered with a level of precision that seemed almost unbelievable given the object's minuscule size. Some of the details were carved at a scale of fractions of a millimeter, details so fine that researchers needed high-powered photography just to fully appreciate the artistry involved. This is where the Griffin warrior tomb shifts from remarkable discovery into genuine, still-debated mystery. How was this object made? The Pylos combat agate dates to roughly 1450 BC, a period without any known magnifying tools, corrective lenses, or optical aids of any kind. Yet the precision of the carving suggests an artisan working with a level of fine motor control and visual acuity that seems to modernize, almost to require optical assistance we don't believe existed at the time. Some researchers have proposed that skilled Bronze Age artisans may have possessed extraordinary natural visual acuity, potentially combined with specialized carving techniques and tools we don't yet fully understand, allowing this level of detail to be achieved through skill, patience, and possibly simple magnifying devices like polished crystal or water-filled containers. Rudimentary optical aids that would leave little to no archaeological trace. This remains the leading, most widely accepted explanation among mainstream archaeologists. Not evidence of technology we failed to identify, but evidence that we have significantly underestimated the raw skill achievable by master artisans working within Bronze Age constraints. Others find that explanation only partially satisfying. The debate isn't about whether the object exists. It clearly does, and has been extensively studied, photographed, and verified by multiple independent researchers. The debate is about what its existence implies about the limits of craftsmanship we thought we understood. If a single, anonymous Bronze Age artisan working somewhere in or connected to the Mycenaean world could produce something this precise, using only tools presumed available at the time, what does that suggest about other objects from this period that we may have too quickly dismissed as impossible or exaggerated? Could there be other, similarly extraordinary miniature works from this era, dismissed by earlier archaeologists, or damaged beyond recognition, or simply never found? It's a question that doesn't have a clean answer, and researchers studying the piece have been notably cautious about drawing conclusions beyond what the physical evidence directly supports. But the agate has already reshaped, in a small but meaningful way, assumptions about the technical ceiling of Bronze Age craftsmanship. The identity of the Griffin warrior himself raises its own set of unresolved questions. Analysis of the skeletal remains indicated a physically robust individual, though the exact nature of his social role remains a matter of informed speculation, rather than settled fact. Some of the imagery found within the grave, including scenes depicting religious or ceremonial themes alongside the combat imagery, has led some researchers to propose that he may have held a combined role. A warrior priest, perhaps, or a figure whose authority extended into both martial and religious or ceremonial domains, a combination not unusual for elite figures in Bronze Age societies, but rarely documented with this much physical evidence to support it. What makes the timing of the burial particularly significant is its place in the broader story of Mycenaean Greece. The Griffin warrior lived and died before the construction of the famous royal tombs at Mycenae itself. The shaft graves and later tholos tombs long associated with figures like Agamemnon in later Greek legend, even though the historical connection to Homer's specific characters remains firmly in the realm of literary tradition rather than archaeological fact. This means the Griffin warrior's burial predates, and may have directly influenced, the burial customs and material culture that would later come to define the height of Mycenaean civilization. Many of the artistic motifs found in the Griffin warrior's tomb, including imagery connecting to Minoan Crete, the earlier and highly influential civilization centered on that island to the south, suggest significant cultural exchange between mainland Greece and Crete during this formative period, well before the two cultures are traditionally understood to have fully merged into what we now recognize as the broader Mycenaean world. Some of the gold rings found in the burial depict distinctly Minoan religious imagery, raising a genuinely open question. Was the Griffin warrior himself connected to Crete in some direct way, whether through ancestry, trade, or cultural allegiance? Or does his tomb simply reflect how deeply Minoan artistic and religious influence had already spread to the mainland during this critical, transitional period, regardless of his own personal origins? Researchers studying the tomb have leaned toward the latter explanation, viewing the burial as powerful evidence of just how early and how deeply Minoan cultural influence shaped the eventual rise of Mycenaean civilization, effectively rewriting part of the timeline for how these two great Bronze Age cultures of the Aegean interacted and influenced one another. But the precise nature of that relationship, and the Griffin warrior's own personal connection to it, if any, remains genuinely unresolved. There's also the broader question the discovery raises about archaeological assumption itself. Pylos had been excavated for nearly a century before the Griffin warrior's tomb was found. Generations of archaeologists had walked, surveyed, and studied that landscape, reasonably assuming that a site this thoroughly documented had little left to reveal. The tomb's discovery, tucked beneath unremarkable stones in an active olive grove, quietly challenged that assumption in a way that continues to unsettle researchers working at other well-studied ancient sites around the world. If an intact, undisturbed royal-level burial could remain hidden for over 3,000 years within a few hundred meters of one of the most excavated palace sites in Greece, what does that suggest about other supposedly fully explored archaeological landscapes? How many other Griffin warriors or objects of comparable significance might still be waiting beneath ground long assumed to have already given up its secrets? The tomb at Pylos has since been carefully documented, its contents conserved and studied extensively by researchers who continue to publish new findings related to the burial even now, years after its initial discovery. But the central questions it raised haven't been fully resolved, only refined. We know more about who the Griffin warrior may have been, more about the cultural currents flowing through his world, more about the astonishing artistic capabilities of his era. What we still don't know, with certainty, is exactly how a single anonymous craftsman achieved a level of precision that continues to challenge our assumptions about what Bronze Age hands and eyes, working without the tools we take for granted today, were truly capable of. Perhaps the smallest object in the tomb turned out to hold the largest question of all. A warrior buried with a masterpiece small enough to fit in the palm of a hand and detailed enough to make us wonder, still, exactly how it was made. Every discovery so far in this exploration has forced historians to push back the timeline of something: sophistication, organization, craftsmanship, violence. But nothing prepares you for what happened in October of 1972 on the outskirts of a Bulgarian city on the Black Sea coast, when an electrician named Ryko Marinov, digging a trench for underground cables, struck something that would ultimately force archaeologists to rewrite the entire chronology of human civilization's relationship with gold. Varna is an old city, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in Europe, sitting along a stretch of Black Sea coastline that has drawn human habitation for thousands of years. In the early 1970s, it was an unremarkable place for a major discovery. A working industrial zone, not an area anyone expected to yield archaeological treasure. Marinov's trench cut into what turned out to be the edge of an ancient burial ground, and the objects he uncovered were immediately, unmistakably, golden. What followed was one of the most significant archaeological excavations of the 20th century. Over the following years, and continuing intermittently for decades afterward, archaeologists led by Ivan Ivanov systematically excavated what became known as the Varna necropolis, a burial ground containing 294 graves, dating to roughly 4600 to 4200 BC. Read that date again. Not the first millennium BC, like the Scythians of Pazyryk. Not the second millennium BC, like the Griffin warrior or Sutton who. This is the 5th millennium BC, nearly 7,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, the Varna burials predate the construction of the Egyptian pyramids by well over 1,000 years. They predate the invention of the wheel in most parts of the world. They predate writing itself by well over 1,000 years, in any form, anywhere on Earth. And within this staggeringly ancient burial ground, archaeologists found gold. Not a small amount. Not a few scattered ornaments. They found what remains to this day the oldest known worked gold in the world. Over 3,000 gold artifacts, weighing a combined total of more than 6 kilograms, distributed across the site with a level of concentration that immediately raised questions about who these people were and how they had organized their society. Most of the graves at Varna contained relatively modest goods, consistent with what archaeologists would expect from a moderately prosperous Neolithic farming community: pottery, tools, occasional copper items, personal ornaments. But scattered among these ordinary burials were a small number of graves containing wealth so disproportionate that they seemed to belong to an entirely different world. The most famous of these is Grave 43. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of a man, likely in his 40s at the time of death, buried with an almost incomprehensible quantity of gold. A golden scepter, its haft covered in worked gold. Golden bracelets. A golden penis sheath, a detail that has drawn considerable scholarly attention regarding what it might suggest about status, fertility symbolism, or ritual significance in this culture. Gold appliques that had once been sewn onto clothing, so numerous that researchers believe his garments would have been almost entirely covered in reflective gold ornamentation. In total, Grave 43 alone contained more gold than has been found across the entire rest of the known world from this same time period, combined. This single burial fundamentally altered how archaeologists understood the emergence of social hierarchy in prehistoric Europe. For decades before Varna's discovery, the mainstream archaeological consensus held that Neolithic European societies were essentially egalitarian. Small farming communities without significant social stratification, without kings, without an elite class capable of commanding this level of accumulated wealth and specialized craftsmanship. Complex social hierarchy, in this older view, was something that emerged later, and generally in the context of larger, more centralized civilizations, typically associated with the Bronze Age or the rise of early cities in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Grave 43 obliterated that assumption. Here was clear, undeniable evidence that by 4600 BC, a full millennium before Egypt's first pharaohs, some society in what is now Bulgaria had developed the social complexity necessary to identify, elevate, and lavishly bury an individual of extraordinary status. Someone with access to specialized goldsmiths, control over rare and valuable materials, and a community willing and able to dedicate immense resources toward honoring him in death. Who was this man? The mainstream archaeological interpretation suggests he was likely a chieftain, a religious leader, or possibly some combination of both. An early ruler whose authority extended over what appears to have been a genuinely prosperous, well-organized society centered around Varna and the surrounding Black Sea coastal region. The presence of copper tools throughout the site, alongside the gold, points to a community actively engaged in early metallurgy, one of the technological hallmarks that would come to define the later transition from the Neolithic period into what archaeologists call the Chalcolithic, or Copper Age. But identifying his general role doesn't fully answer the deeper question that Grave 43 raises. How did a society this early in human history develop the technical knowledge required to work gold at all? Goldsmithing isn't a simple technology. Even in its most basic forms, it requires an understanding of extraction, an ability to identify and separate gold from other materials in its raw state, and metalworking techniques capable of shaping a relatively soft but stubborn metal into precise, decorative, and symbolic forms. The artifacts recovered from Varna show clear evidence of hammering, annealing, and other deliberate metalworking processes, not crude, accidental shaping, but genuine craftsmanship, refined enough to suggest specialized artisans who had likely dedicated significant time to mastering the material. Where did this knowledge come from? Archaeologists studying the broader region have proposed that the Varna culture, part of what's sometimes referred to as the Chalcolithic cultures of the Balkans, may represent one of the earliest, if not the earliest, centers of metallurgical innovation anywhere in the world, a claim supported by other nearby sites in Bulgaria and the surrounding region that show similarly early evidence of copper and gold working. In this view, Varna isn't an anomaly borrowing technology from elsewhere. It may represent something closer to ground zero for a technological revolution that would eventually spread outward, influencing metalworking traditions across much of Europe and potentially beyond. This raises a genuinely fascinating question about how we've traditionally understood the flow of civilizational development. The conventional historical narrative, inherited largely from 19th and early 20th century archaeology, tended to position Mesopotamia and Egypt as the primary sources of early technological and civilizational innovation, with these advances gradually diffusing outward to what were long considered more peripheral regions, including the Balkans and the rest of prehistoric Europe. Varna complicates that narrative considerably. If a sophisticated gold-working tradition, supported by real social hierarchy and specialized craft production, was already flourishing along the Black Sea coast a full 1,000 years before Egypt's pyramids, then the old model of civilization radiating outward from a small number of ancient Near Eastern centers may be, at minimum, incomplete. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that Varna represents evidence of an early, independent cradle of civilization in its own right, a society that developed social complexity, specialized craft production, long-distance trade, and hierarchical burial practices on a timeline and trajectory largely separate from the more commonly cited early civilizations of the Fertile Crescent. This remains a genuinely debated position within archaeology, not universally accepted, but taken seriously enough that Varna is now regularly cited in broader discussions about the true, more geographically distributed origins of complex human society. The mystery deepens further when you examine the wider pattern of burials across the necropolis, because Varna doesn't just raise questions about who these elite individuals were. It raises questions about who, or what, some of the burials represented at all. Among the 294 graves excavated, archaeologists identified a significant number that contained no human remains whatsoever, despite being furnished with grave goods, including gold, in patterns similar to the burials that did contain bodies. These are known as cenotaph, or symbolic, graves. Burials constructed and furnished as though for a specific individual, but without an actual physical body interred within them. Several of these symbolic graves contained clay masks, positioned where a head would normally rest, some adorned with gold ornamentation around what would have been the mouth, eyes, and forehead area of the mask, as if standing in for a face that was, for whatever reason, physically absent from the burial. Alongside these masks, some graves contained gold sheaths, clearly modeled to sit atop what should have been a body's genitals, along with bracelets and ornaments positioned in the general anatomical arrangement a real body would have occupied, were one actually present. Why would this community construct such elaborate gold-laden burials for people who were, physically, not there? The explanations offered by archaeologists remain genuinely speculative, and researchers studying the site have been careful to present multiple possibilities rather than asserting a single confirmed answer. One theory suggests these symbolic graves may have honored individuals who died away from the settlement. Lost at sea, perhaps, or killed while traveling for trade, their bodies never recovered but still deserving, in the eyes of their community, of a proper ceremonial burial befitting their status. Another proposes these graves may represent purely ceremonial or religious burials, dedicated not to specific deceased individuals at all, but to symbolic or mythological figures central to this culture's belief system. effectively burials in service of ritual rather than personal mourning. A further possibility, less commonly emphasized but occasionally raised in academic discussion, suggests these cenotaph graves might represent burials for individuals who were, for reasons specific to this culture's own beliefs about status, purity, or ritual significance, deliberately excluded from physical burial altogether, honored instead through symbolic representation rather than the interment of an actual body. We don't know which explanation, if any, is correct. What we do know is that this culture had developed a genuinely sophisticated relationship with symbolic representation and ceremonial practice, one nuanced enough to distinguish between different categories of the deceased, or the symbolically deceased, worthy of dramatically different forms of commemoration. There's another layer to the Varna mystery worth sitting with, and it concerns not what was found, but what disappeared afterward. The Varna culture, along with several related Chalcolithic cultures across the wider Balkan and Black Sea region, appears to have gone into significant decline sometime around 4200 BC, the same general period marking the end of the burials at the Varna necropolis itself. This wasn't a gradual fade into obscurity. The archaeological record shows what appears to have been a relatively abrupt collapse, with evidence of settlement abandonment across the broader region, disruption of the trade and craft networks that had supported the elaborate gold-working traditions, and a marked decline in the kind of social complexity and specialized production that had defined the culture at its height. What caused this collapse remains, like so much about Varna, a matter of ongoing debate rather than settled consensus. Some researchers point to climatic shifts during this period, potentially affecting agricultural productivity across the region and undermining the economic foundation that had allowed such elaborate social hierarchy and craft specialization to flourish in the first place. Others have proposed the arrival of new population groups migrating into the region from the Eurasian steppe further to the east and north, groups associated with different burial customs, different material culture, and, according to some genetic and archaeological studies, a different subsistence strategy centered more heavily on pastoralism rather than the settled agriculture that had supported Varna's earlier prosperity. This migration theory connects intriguingly to a broader and still actively researched question in archaeology and genetics regarding population movements across late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic Europe, sweeping demographic shifts that some researchers argue reshaped much of the continent's population and cultural landscape during roughly this same general period. Whether these migrations were peaceful, violent, gradual, or sudden remains genuinely contested among researchers studying the broader transition, and Varna's own collapse may represent just one regional example within this much larger, still poorly understood pattern of change sweeping across prehistoric Europe. Whatever the specific cause, the result was a genuine loss. The sophisticated gold-working tradition that had produced the treasures of Grave 43 didn't simply continue evolving elsewhere. In many respects, it appears to have been a technological and cultural peak that wasn't immediately matched again in the region for a considerable period afterward. It would be centuries before comparably sophisticated metalworking traditions re-emerged in this part of Europe, raising an uncomfortable question about the fragility of even genuinely advanced ancient societies. How much specialized knowledge, how much accumulated technical mastery can simply be lost when the social and economic conditions supporting it collapse, even when the underlying human ingenuity that produced it in the first place hasn't gone anywhere? Excavation at the Varna necropolis, while extensive, is understood by researchers to be incomplete. The site itself extends beyond the areas that have been fully excavated, and archaeologists studying the region continue to investigate related sites along the Bulgarian Black Sea coast that may hold further evidence about this culture's true extent, its trade connections, and the full scope of its technological achievements. Some researchers believe related settlements and burial sites, potentially containing further evidence of this same sophisticated gold-working tradition, remain undiscovered or only partially studied across the wider region. There's also the matter of where, precisely, all this gold actually originated. Analysis of the gold artifacts recovered from Varna suggests it likely came from local or regional sources, though the exact original mining or extraction locations haven't been definitively identified. For a technology this early, this raises its own quiet question. If a Chalcolithic community had already developed the prospecting knowledge necessary to locate, extract, and refine gold from the earth by 4600 BC, what does that suggest about the broader depth of environmental and geological knowledge this culture possessed? Knowledge that, like so much else about them, left behind no written record to directly explain itself to us. Standing at the heart of all of this remains that one extraordinary burial, Grave 43, and the man within it, covered head to foot in gold, buried 1,000 years before Egypt's first pyramid rose from the desert sand. We don't know his name. We don't know precisely what he ruled over, or how he came to hold whatever authority clearly commanded this level of communal wealth and craftsmanship in his honor. We know only that somewhere along the Black Sea coast, in a period of human history, we once assumed was defined almost entirely by simple subsistence farming. A society had already developed the social complexity, technical mastery, and symbolic sophistication to create something this extraordinary. And then, for reasons still not entirely understood, saw that achievement fade before it could be fully built upon. Perhaps the deepest mystery of Varna isn't a single unanswered question at all, but the broader implication sitting beneath everything the site has revealed. That human civilization's story may not be the single, steadily ascending line of progress we often imagine it to be, moving neatly from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. It may instead be something closer to what the Varna necropolis itself suggests: scattered peaks of genuine sophistication, rising unexpectedly in unexpected places, sometimes flourishing for generations before receding again, leaving behind only scattered golden fragments for a much later civilization to stumble across, quite by accident, while digging a trench for something as mundane as underground cables. How many other such peaks are still waiting beneath the ground somewhere, entirely unknown to us, their own golden chieftains and symbolic graves and lost technical mastery sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for the right accident, at the right place, to finally bring them back into the light? Gold explains itself, in a sense. Its value is immediate, its allure universal, its presence in a burial an obvious marker of status that any culture, in any era, would understand instinctively. But high in the Austrian Alps, above a lake so still it seems to hold its breath, another substance was once considered just as precious, just as worth dying for, just as capable of building an entire civilization around its extraction. That substance wasn't gold. It was salt. The town of Hallstatt sits wedged between a steep mountainside and the dark waters of Lake Hallstatt in the Salzkammergut region of Austria, a name that translates, fittingly, to something like Salt Chamber Estate, a region entirely defined for thousands of years by what lies beneath its mountains. Today, Hallstatt is known primarily for its beauty, its pastel-colored houses stacked improbably along the lakeshore, drawing photographers and tourists from around the world. But long before it became a postcard image, Hallstatt was something else entirely. The site of what may be the oldest known salt mine in the world, and a place so archaeologically significant that an entire period of European prehistory, the Hallstatt culture, spanning roughly 800 to 450 BC, takes its name directly from this single location. To understand why salt mattered enough to build a civilization around, you have to set aside modern assumptions. Today, salt is cheap, abundant, sitting forgotten in shakers on kitchen tables. In the ancient world, it was something closer to essential infrastructure. Salt preserved meat and fish through long winters when fresh food wasn't available. It was necessary for certain metalworking and tanning processes. It held genuine nutritional importance for both humans and livestock. A reliable, high-quality source of salt wasn't a luxury. It was the kind of resource capable of making a relatively small alpine community extraordinarily wealthy and influential, provided they controlled it effectively. The people of ancient Hallstatt controlled it very effectively indeed. Archaeological evidence suggests that salt mining at Hallstatt began remarkably early, with some evidence pointing to activity as far back as the Neolithic period. Though the mining operation expanded dramatically during the Bronze Age and reached its most sophisticated, best documented phase during the Iron Age culture that would eventually take the site's name. What makes Hallstatt such an extraordinary archaeological resource isn't simply that mining happened here. It's the same principle we've encountered before in this exploration, at Must Farm and in the Altai Mountains. An accident of environment that preserved what should never have survived. Salt, it turns out, is a remarkably effective preservative. The high salt concentration within the mine tunnels created an environment almost entirely hostile to the bacteria and organic decay processes that normally destroy ancient organic material within decades or centuries. Combined with the naturally cool, stable temperature deep within the mountain, the Hallstatt mines preserved not just the tools and debris of ancient mining operations, but organic material that almost never survives from this period anywhere else in the world. Wood, textile, leather, and even, in a discovery as remarkable as it is unsettling, fragments of human waste, providing archaeologists with direct physical evidence of the ancient diet consumed by the miners who worked here thousands of years ago. Analysis of preserved fecal material recovered from the mines revealed a diet considerably more sophisticated than researchers might have expected from prehistoric alpine miners. Traces of blue cheese and beer, alongside various grains, fruits, and evidence of what appears to have been a fairly varied, well-rounded diet, suggested a mining community that was neither poor nor deprived, but reasonably prosperous, capable of accessing fermented and processed foods that required genuine culinary and agricultural sophistication to produce. This single unglamorous category of preserved evidence has told researchers more about ancient daily diet than almost any other archaeological source from this period in Central Europe. But it's not simply the diet of Hallstatt's ancient miners that has captured attention. It's the miners themselves. Deep within the tunnel systems, archaeologists have recovered the mummified remains of miners who died within the mine, their bodies preserved by the same combination of salt saturation and stable, cool temperature that preserved everything else. Unlike the deliberately embalmed mummies of ancient Egypt, or the ceremonially buried, naturally frozen bodies of Pazyryk, these are, in most cases, believed to represent something more immediate and considerably more grim. Workers who died accidentally, buried by collapsing tunnels or trapped by mining accidents, entombed not through ceremony but through catastrophe, and preserved afterward almost by chance, sealed within salt-saturated rock for millennia. Perhaps the most well-known of these figures is a body discovered in 1734, when miners working the ancient tunnel systems came across what they initially assumed might be a fellow worker recently lost in an accident. Instead, they had found what came to be known as the man in salt, a mummified body so well preserved that its clothing, skin, and even the leather cap covering its head remained largely intact, despite the body having lain buried within the mine for what researchers would later determine to be well over 2,000 years. The discovery deeply unsettled the 18th century miners who found him. Accustomed to the physical dangers of their profession, but unprepared for the sight of a preserved body reaching across such an enormous span of time, some accounts from the period describe the body being given what the miners considered an appropriate Christian burial in the local churchyard. A decision that, from a modern archaeological perspective, represents an almost unbearable loss. The body was buried before adequate scientific documentation could take place, and its precise original location within the extensive tunnel system was, in the confusion, never fully recorded. Later attempts to relocate and further study the remains proved unsuccessful. The body, along with whatever additional information its position and condition might have revealed, was effectively lost to modern archaeology, a casualty of good intentions colliding with an era that lacked the scientific framework to fully appreciate what had been found. It's a frustrating footnote in Hallstatt's story, but a revealing one. It illustrates a recurring, quietly tragic pattern in the history of accidental archaeological discovery. Significant finds made by people without the context or training to recognize their full importance, handled according to the values and understanding of their own time, sometimes at direct cost to the historical record future researchers would give a great deal to have preserved. Fortunately, the man in salt wasn't the only such discovery. and subsequent finds within the Hallstatt mines have been treated with considerably more scientific care, yielding information that continues to reshape our understanding of ancient mining life and, more broadly, ancient labor and social organization. What these later discoveries reveal is a mining operation of startling scale and organizational sophistication for its era. The tunnel systems extend for kilometers into the mountain, some reaching depths of over 100 meters below the surface, requiring genuinely advanced engineering knowledge to construct and maintain safely, at least by the standards of what many historians once assumed prehistoric societies were capable of achieving. Wooden support structures, staircases, and even a prehistoric wooden gutter system for managing water within the tunnels have all been recovered in remarkable states of preservation, revealing a mining operation that wasn't casual or improvised, but carefully planned, engineered, and maintained over generations of continuous use. Perhaps most significantly, researchers have recovered evidence suggesting the mines operated on a genuinely large scale, employing what may have been a substantial workforce operating according to organized shift patterns, using specialized tools including bronze picks and later iron tools specifically designed for salt extraction, along with leather sacks and backpacks used to haul extracted salt out of the tunnel system. Some examples of which have survived in remarkably intact condition thanks to the same preservative properties that saved everything else within the mine. This level of organization raises questions that echo, in some ways, the questions raised by Tollense Valley's battlefield and Varna's golden graves. How did a relatively small alpine community develop the social and economic structures necessary to organize, sustain, and profit from an industrial operation of this scale and complexity? Particularly during a period many historians once characterized as culturally and technologically limited compared to the larger, more centralized civilizations of the Mediterranean and Near East? The answer, increasingly supported by the archaeological evidence, points to Hallstatt functioning as a genuine economic and cultural hub, one whose influence and trade connections extended considerably further than its modest physical size might suggest. Salt extracted from these mines appears to have been traded extensively throughout Iron Age Europe, and artifacts recovered from burial sites associated with the broader Hallstatt culture, spread across a significant portion of Central Europe, show evidence of far-reaching trade networks, including imported goods from the Mediterranean world, suggesting the wealth generated by salt extraction here fueled connections stretching across much of the continent. But not every aspect of Hallstatt's ancient mining operation fits neatly into a straightforward economic narrative, and this is where the site's history moves from remarkable into genuinely mysterious. Among the human remains recovered from the mines, not all show clear evidence consistent with accidental death from tunnel collapse or other typical mining hazards. Some bodies and skeletal remains display characteristics that have led certain researchers to propose alternative, more troubling explanations for how these individuals came to be entombed within the mountain. Questions have been raised in some specific cases about whether all of the deaths represented by remains found within the mine were genuinely accidental, or whether some might reflect other circumstances entirely. Deaths resulting from disputes, violence, or even in the more speculative theories occasionally raised in academic discussion, deliberate ritual practices tied to the mine's clear economic and, quite possibly, spiritual significance to the community that depended on it. This remains firmly in the realm of speculation rather than established fact, and mainstream archaeological consensus continues to favor accidental mining death as the most likely explanation for the majority of human remains recovered from the tunnels, consistent with the genuine, well-documented dangers of underground salt extraction using Bronze and Iron Age tools and techniques. But the ambiguity surrounding a smaller number of specific cases has never been fully, conclusively resolved, leaving open the quiet possibility that not every story preserved within these salt-saturated tunnels is simply one of industrial accident. There's also the broader question of what the mine meant to the people who depended on it, beyond its obvious economic function. Salt, in many ancient cultures, carried symbolic and even spiritual significance well beyond its practical uses, associated with preservation, purity, and, in some belief systems, protection against decay and death itself. Given how completely the community at Hallstatt organized itself around salt extraction, it seems reasonable to wonder whether the substance, and the mountain that produced it, held meaning for these people that extended beyond simple economic value into something closer to genuine reverence, or even fear. The elaborate burial goods recovered from Hallstatt culture graves throughout the surrounding region, some containing genuinely impressive quantities of bronze, iron, and imported luxury goods, suggest a society that took considerable care in honoring its dead, care that may well have extended to how they understood and related to the mountain and mine that had provided their community's wealth in the first place. We simply don't have direct textual evidence to confirm exactly what beliefs, if any, the Hallstatt miners held about the substance they extracted or the mountain they extracted it from. Like so many of the cultures explored throughout this journey, the people of ancient Hallstatt left behind no written explanation of their own worldview. What they left instead is physical: tunnels, tools, preserved bodies, and traces of the food they ate and the labor they performed, all of it requiring careful archaeological interpretation to even partially reconstruct. Excavation and research at Hallstatt continues even now, and the mine remains, remarkably, at least partially active as a working salt operation, making it possibly the oldest continuously utilized industrial site in human history, connecting modern salt extraction directly, physically, to a mining tradition stretching back well over 3,000 years. That continuity is itself a kind of quiet marvel, a resource valuable enough, and a location practical enough to keep drawing human labor and human presence back to the same mountain, generation after generation, culture after culture, for a length of time that dwarfs the entire span of many civilizations we consider ancient. Yet for all that continuity, significant portions of the ancient tunnel systems remain unexplored, either because they're structurally unsafe for modern investigation, or because they simply haven't yet been prioritized for the kind of careful, resource-intensive excavation that sites like this require. Researchers studying Hallstatt widely believe that further mummified remains, additional tools, and potentially significant new evidence about the daily lives, beliefs, and deaths of these ancient miners likely still remain sealed within the mountain, preserved by the same salt that has already yielded so much, waiting for future excavation to bring them into the light. What might those unexplored tunnels still contain? More bodies, certainly. The mine's own scale and long history of use practically guarantee it. But perhaps also further evidence that could finally help resolve the more ambiguous cases already recovered, clarifying whether all of Hallstatt's ancient dead truly died by simple accident, or whether some part of this mountain's long history involved something more deliberate, more troubling than the straightforward hazards of prehistoric industrial labor. There's something fitting, in the end, about a mystery preserved not by ice, or fire, or careful ceremonial burial, but by the very substance a community spent generations extracting from the earth beneath their feet. Salt sustained the people of Hallstatt in life, fueling trade networks and social organizations sophisticated enough to name an entire era of European prehistory. And in a strange, almost poetic turn, that same salt preserved fragments of their deaths well enough that, thousands of years later, we're still standing at the mouth of their tunnels, still asking the same basic questions their bodies have never quite been able to fully answer for us. Who exactly were you? How exactly did your story end within this mountain? And how much more of it still waits, quietly preserved in the dark tunnels we haven't yet found reason or courage to fully explore? Hallstatt's story was one of patience, a resource extracted slowly, deliberately, over centuries of organized labor. What was found in a quiet farmer's field in the English Midlands tells almost the opposite kind of story. Not patient accumulation, but violent, hurried disruption, captured in a single buried moment of gold and silver that has left historians arguing over its meaning ever since. In July of 2009, a metal detectorist named Terry Herbert was searching a recently plowed field near the village of Hammerwich in Staffordshire, England, using equipment he'd operated as a hobby for years without any particularly significant discovery to show for it. What his detector picked up that afternoon would turn out to be, without exaggeration, one of the most important archaeological finds in British history, and arguably the single most significant discovery of Anglo-Saxon gold ever recorded. Over the following days, as Herbert continued searching the field and reporting his findings to the appropriate archaeological authorities, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't an isolated object, or even a handful of scattered items. This was something else entirely. A genuine hoard, buried deliberately, containing an almost incomprehensible quantity of gold and silver military and ceremonial objects. When professional archaeologists completed their systematic excavation of the site, the final count was staggering. More than 4,600 individual items and fragments, together weighing over 5 kilograms of gold and 1.4 kilograms of silver, making the Staffordshire hoard, by a considerable margin, the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold ever discovered, dwarfing even the treasures recovered decades earlier from the ship burial at Sutton. But it wasn't simply the quantity of gold that stunned researchers. It was the nature of what that gold had once been. Unlike Sutton, whose treasures included a broad range of object types, ceremonial items, imported luxury goods, personal ornaments alongside weapons, the Staffordshire hoard consisted almost exclusively of martial and military objects. Sword pommels, sword hilt fittings, helmet fragments, and other pieces of high-status battle equipment, many of them deliberately, forcibly removed from the larger objects they had once decorated. Fittings had been torn or cut away from sword hilts. Precious metal had been stripped from larger ceremonial or military items, leaving behind only the gold and silver components, disassembled and separated from whatever they had originally adorned. This detail, more than almost anything else about the hoard, has driven the central, still unresolved debate among researchers studying it. Why would someone deliberately dismantle so many extraordinarily valuable objects, stripping them down to their precious metal components, before burying the resulting collection in the ground? The most straightforward, widely favored explanation treats the hoard as war booty. Trophies, essentially, stripped from defeated enemies following one or more significant battles, likely during the tumultuous period of the 7th century AD, when the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, in whose territory the hoard was found, was engaged in near-constant warfare and political maneuvering against neighboring kingdoms for regional dominance across what is now England. Under this interpretation, the objects represent captured wealth, deliberately dismantled to remove and consolidate their valuable precious metal content, likely intended either for eventual melting down and reforging into new objects, or simply for straightforward storage and transport as a more compact, easily concealed form of portable wealth. It's a reasonable theory, well grounded in the historical context of the period. Mercia during the 7th century was indeed one of the most powerful and militarily active Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, ruled during this general time frame by figures including King Penda, a ruler whose reign was defined substantially by conflict with neighboring kingdoms, including Northumbria and East Anglia. If the hoard does represent accumulated battle trophies, it would align well with what historical sources tell us about the sheer frequency and intensity of warfare defining this period of English history, sometimes referred to, somewhat dramatically but not inaccurately, as a genuine Game of Thrones era of early medieval Britain, marked by shifting alliances, brutal succession struggles, and near-constant conflict between rival kingdoms. But this explanation, while broadly accepted, doesn't fully account for several details that continue to puzzle researchers. First, there's the matter of what's conspicuously absent from the hoard. Despite containing thousands of individual gold and silver fragments, the hoard contains almost no feminine jewelry or personal ornamentation of the kind typically associated with everyday Anglo-Saxon elite life. No brooches of the type commonly found in burial sites from this period. Very little in the way of what might be considered simple decorative wealth unrelated to warfare. The hoard is almost entirely martial in character, dominated overwhelmingly by war gear. This near-total absence of non-military material has led some researchers to question whether war booty, in the sense of general plunder taken indiscriminately from a defeated enemy, fully explains a collection this specifically, narrowly focused on military and weapon-related items. Second, there's the presence of several distinctly religious objects within the hoard, including a large folded gold cross, along with a smaller strip of gold bearing an inscribed Latin biblical text. The inscription, drawn from the Book of Numbers, translates roughly to an invocation calling for God's protection and the scattering of enemies. A text with obvious direct military and protective significance. The fact that these Christian religious objects were found folded, seemingly deliberately, and buried alongside distinctly martial treasure, raises questions about the specific circumstances and intent behind the hoard's burial. Was folding the cross a practical decision, simply making the object more compact for burial or transport? Or did it carry some deeper symbolic significance, perhaps related to the religious and political tensions of a period when Christianity was still becoming firmly established across some, though not all, of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with some rulers, including Penda of Mercia himself, believed to have remained pagan even as neighboring kingdoms increasingly converted. This detail connects the Staffordshire hoard to a broader theme we've already encountered in this exploration. Back at Sutton, the complex, sometimes contradictory religious landscape of early Anglo-Saxon England, a period when paganism and Christianity coexisted, competed, and occasionally blended together within the same kingdoms, sometimes even within the beliefs of the same individual rulers. Third, and perhaps most puzzling of all, is the question of why the hoard was buried at all, and why, having been buried, it was apparently never reclaimed. If the objects represented straightforward war booty, intended for eventual reforging or redistribution as a display and reward of military success, why bury them rather than immediately putting them to that intended use? Some researchers propose the burial may have been a temporary practical measure, treasure hidden for safekeeping during an unstable or dangerous period, fully intended to be recovered once circumstances allowed, but for reasons lost to history, that recovery simply never happened. Perhaps the individual or group responsible for burying the hoard died before they could return for it, taking the specific knowledge of its location with them. Perhaps a shift in political fortune, a lost battle, or a sudden change in local power made recovery impossible or simply too dangerous to attempt. Others have proposed a more ritual explanation, suggesting the hoard's burial may have carried genuine ceremonial or votive significance beyond simple practical concealment. An offering, perhaps, connected to specific religious or cultural practices of the period, intended to be permanent rather than temporary from the outset. Under this interpretation, the deliberate dismantling of the martial objects prior to burial wouldn't represent simple practical consolidation of valuable metal, but a symbolic act, perhaps intended to render captured enemy war gear permanently unusable, a form of ritual decommissioning meant to neutralize the object's original martial power and purpose before offering them, whether to the earth itself, to a deity, or to some other cultural or religious concept that we, without written explanation from the culture responsible, can only partially reconstruct. The location of the burial itself adds another layer to this puzzle. The hoard was found buried near what would have been, during the Anglo-Saxon period, a significant Roman road, in a location without any clear evidence of a nearby settlement or building that might explain a straightforward practical reason for burial at that specific spot. Why here, along a route rather than within or near a settlement where the treasure's owners presumably lived? Some researchers suggest the roadside location may have held practical significance related to travel and transport, perhaps representing treasure being actively moved from one location to another when circumstances forced its sudden concealment. Others note that the general area does show some evidence of broader Anglo-Saxon activity and significance during this period, suggesting the burial location, while not immediately adjacent to an obvious settlement, may still have held meaning within the wider landscape and political geography of 7th century Mercia that isn't fully visible to us today. What makes untangling these competing theories especially difficult is the fragmentary, disassembled nature of the hoard itself. because so many objects were deliberately broken down into individual components before burial, reconstructing what the original complete items actually looked like, and by extension, understanding more about who originally owned and used them has required years of painstaking conservation and research work. Archaeologists and conservators have had to essentially solve an enormous three-dimensional puzzle, piecing together fragments to identify complete sword pommels, helmet cheek pieces, and other original objects from among thousands of individually catalogued pieces. This ongoing conservation work has itself yielded remarkable discoveries. Among the reconstructed items, researchers identified fragments belonging to what would have been an extraordinarily elaborate ceremonial helmet, decorated with intricate gold and garnet cloisonné work, comparable in quality and craftsmanship to the famous helmet recovered from Sutton, suggesting the Staffordshire Hoard once contained war gear belonging to individuals of the very highest social and political status, quite possibly including royalty. If accurate, this raises the tantalizing possibility that among the fragments recovered from this Staffordshire field lie the physical remains of equipment once worn by kings, princes, or other significant royal or noble figures of 7th century Mercia and its rival kingdoms. Individuals whose names may well appear in the surviving historical record, their war gear now reduced to disassembled fragments buried in a farmer's field for over 1,300 years. Could specific objects within the hoard be traced back to known historical figures from this period? Researchers have approached this question cautiously, aware of how easily speculation in this area can outrun what the physical evidence actually supports. Without inscriptions directly naming original owners, definitively connecting specific fragments to specific historical individuals remains extremely difficult, if not impossible, using currently available evidence and techniques. But the sheer quality and status implied by objects like the reconstructed helmet make clear that whoever originally possessed these items moved in the very highest circles of Anglo-Saxon political and military power during this period. There's a broader significance to the Staffordshire Hoard that extends beyond questions of individual ownership, connecting it to themes we've now encountered repeatedly throughout this exploration. Like the Griffin warrior's combat agate, several objects within the hoard display metalworking craftsmanship of remarkable technical sophistication, including garnet cloisonné work requiring genuine skill and specialized knowledge to produce at this level of quality and consistency across thousands of individual gold and silver components. Like Varna's golden burials, the hoard provides direct physical evidence of genuine hierarchical wealth concentration and specialized craft production within a society sometimes still popularly imagined, inaccurately, as culturally limited during this broader historical period. And like Sutton, the hoard offers a rare, tangible connection to the internal political and religious complexity of early Anglo-Saxon England, a period frustratingly underdocumented by surviving written historical sources compared to what followed in later centuries. Research into the hoard continues even now, well over a decade after its initial discovery, with conservators and archaeologists still working through the painstaking process of cleaning, cataloging, and attempting to reconstruct original objects from among the thousands of individual fragments recovered from that Staffordshire field. Each new reconstruction adds further detail to our understanding of 7th century Mercian craftsmanship, wealth, and military culture. But the central question surrounding the hoard, why it was buried, by whom, under what specific circumstances, and why it was never reclaimed across more than 13 centuries remain, despite all this careful research, genuinely unresolved. We're left in the end with fragments, literal and figurative. Literal fragments of gold and silver, painstakingly reassembled piece by modern conservators, and figurative fragments of a story we can only partially reconstruct. A period of intense warfare and shifting political power, a religious landscape caught between old pagan traditions and a still spreading new Christian faith, and an act of deliberate, careful burial whose original purpose, whether practical, ritual, or some combination of both, was never subsequently followed by recovery. Somewhere in 7th century Mercia, someone made a deliberate decision to dismantle extraordinary wealth, fold a golden cross, and place all of it into the ground beside a Roman road. They likely believed at the time that this was a temporary measure, or perhaps a meaningful permanent offering, either way presumably understanding exactly why they were doing what they did. That understanding, whatever it was, died with them, or was simply lost amid the genuine chaos and upheaval of a violent, transformative period in early English history. What remains is the treasure itself, patiently waiting in that Staffordshire field for over 1,300 years, until a hobbyist with a metal detector happened to walk across exactly the right patch of recently plowed earth. It raises, as so many of the mysteries in this exploration ultimately do, an uncomfortable and quietly thrilling question. How much more of this fragmented, still not fully understood story might remain scattered beneath England's fields and hillsides, waiting for its own accidental decisive contact with a stranger's detector, decades or centuries from now? Every mystery in this exploration so far has come from the ground, from mud, ice, salt, or sand. This one comes from the sea, and it doesn't concern a tomb, a treasure, or a battlefield. It concerns a single corroded lump of bronze that, for decades after its discovery, sat quietly in a museum drawer, largely misunderstood, before researchers realized they were holding something that shouldn't have been possible for another 14 centuries. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers took shelter from a storm near the small island of Antikythera, a rocky, sparsely inhabited outcrop situated between Crete and the Peloponnese, along one of the ancient world's busiest maritime corridors connecting the eastern Mediterranean to Rome. While waiting out the weather, the divers, working in the old style with heavy canvas suits and copper helmets, began exploring the seabed nearby. At a depth of around 45 meters, one of them, Elias Stadiatus, surfaced in a state of near panic, describing what he'd seen below as a pile of rotting corpses and horses scattered across the ocean floor. What he had actually found was a shipwreck, but not an ordinary one. Subsequent dives confirmed the presence of an ancient Roman-era cargo vessel, its wooden hull long since dissolved, but its cargo remarkably intact after roughly 2,000 years underwater. What the divers had mistaken for corpses were, in fact, the marble and bronze statues that had once filled the ship's hold. Life-sized figures of gods, athletes, and philosophers, remarkably preserved despite centuries submerged in salt water. Over the following months, in what became one of the earliest large-scale underwater archaeological operations in history, divers recovered an extraordinary trove of ancient art and luxury goods: bronze and marble statuary, glassware, jewelry, and coins that allowed researchers to date the wreck to sometime around the 1st century BC, likely a Roman vessel transporting looted or purchased Greek treasures westward, possibly toward Rome itself. It was, on its own terms, already a significant find, offering rare physical insight into the scale and nature of luxury goods trade during this period of Roman expansion into the Greek world. But among the recovered cargo was a smaller, far less immediately impressive object: a shapeless, corroded lump of bronze and wood, roughly the size of a large book, that had fused together over 2 millennia of exposure to seawater. Catalogued among the wreck's other finds, it initially drew relatively little attention. It would take years, and the sharp eye of a Greek archaeologist named Valerios Stais, examining the recovered material back in Athens in 1902, to notice something the corrosion hadn't entirely obscured: a gear wheel embedded in the bronze, its teeth still faintly visible. That single observation opened one of the most enduring and genuinely still not fully resolved mysteries in the history of archaeology. What Stays had noticed was the first visible evidence of what would eventually become known as the Antikythera mechanism, and what researchers would spend the next century, using technology that didn't even exist at the time of its discovery, trying to fully understand. Early study of the object was limited by the technology available. Researchers could see gear teeth and fragments of inscriptions on the corroded bronze plates, but the mechanism's internal structure, fused solid by 2,000 years of marine concretion, remained essentially inaccessible without risking permanent damage to the object itself. For decades, the device remained something of a curiosity, acknowledged as ancient and clearly mechanical in nature, but not yet understood well enough to explain what, precisely, it had been built to do. The breakthrough came gradually, through successive generations of imaging technology. In the 1970s, physicist and science historian Derek de Solla Price used X-ray and gamma-ray imaging to peer inside the corroded fragments without physically dismantling them, revealing a startlingly complex internal gear structure that hinted at a level of mechanical sophistication almost nobody had expected from an object this old. Price's research proposed that the device functioned as a sophisticated astronomical calculator, but the full extent of what it could actually do remained unclear for decades longer, limited by the imaging technology of the time. It wasn't until the early 2000s when a research team including scientists from Cardiff University applied high-resolution 3D X-ray computed tomography, along with advanced surface imaging techniques, that the mechanism's true complexity finally came fully into view. What they found, embedded within 82 surviving fragments, was a device containing at least 30 separate bronze gears, some smaller than a fingertip, meticulously cut with triangular teeth and mounted on a sophisticated system of interlocking dials, all of it originally housed within a wooden case roughly the size of a small mantel clock. And what this device did, once researchers finally decoded its full mechanical function, was nothing short of extraordinary. The Antikythera mechanism, researchers determined, was designed to model and predict astronomical events with remarkable precision. Turning a hand crank on the side of the device would rotate the internal gear train, driving a front dial that displayed the position of the sun and moon against the zodiac, along with a separate lunar phase display that accurately depicted the moon's true, non-uniform orbital speed, accounting for the fact that the moon moves faster and slower at different points in its elliptical path around the Earth, a detail requiring a genuinely sophisticated understanding of astronomical motion to accurately model mechanically. On the back of the device, 2 additional spiral dials tracked longer cycles. One functioned as a calendar capable of predicting solar and lunar eclipses years in advance, incorporating the Saros cycle, an eclipse prediction pattern spanning roughly 18 years, understood by Babylonian astronomers but rarely, if ever, previously associated with functioning Greek mechanical technology of this period. The other dial tracked a 4-year cycle corresponding to the timing of major Pan-Hellenic athletic games, including the Olympics, suggesting the device held cultural and civic significance extending beyond pure astronomical calculation into the scheduling of religious and athletic events central to Greek civic life. Inscriptions covering the device's surface, painstakingly deciphered through the same advanced imaging techniques used to map its gears, included detailed instructions for the mechanism's use, alongside astronomical and calendrical information, confirming that this wasn't a one-off novelty item but a genuinely functional scientific instrument, likely built by someone with deep expertise in both astronomy and precision mechanical engineering. Here is where the mystery truly begins, because nothing else like the Antikythera mechanism has ever been found from the ancient world, from any culture, for well over 1,000 years afterward. The complexity of its gear train, researchers have noted, wasn't matched again in the historical record until the development of astronomical clocks in medieval Europe, beginning in the 14th century AD, nearly 1,500 years after the Antikythera mechanism was built. This enormous technological gap has left historians grappling with an uncomfortable question. How did ancient Greek engineering, at least in this one instance, reach a level of mechanical sophistication that wouldn't be matched again for over a millennium? And why does virtually no other physical or textual evidence of comparable technology survive from the same period? Some answers can be found in what we do know about ancient Greek science and engineering more broadly. Ancient sources, including the Roman writer Cicero, reference mechanical devices built to model the movements of celestial bodies, attributing similar inventions to the renowned Greek mathematician and inventor Archimedes, along with the astronomer Hipparchus, whose theoretical work on lunar motion closely aligns with the specific irregularities the Antikythera mechanism was built to model. This has led many researchers to conclude the device likely emerged from a genuine, if now largely lost, tradition of Hellenistic Greek mechanical astronomy, one that combined the theoretical astronomical work of figures like Hipparchus with practical engineering skill capable of translating that theory into functioning bronze machinery. Under this interpretation, the Antikythera mechanism isn't necessarily a singular, inexplicable anomaly, but rather the sole physical survivor of what may have once been a broader, workshop-based tradition of precision mechanical instrument making centered somewhere in the Greek world, quite possibly on the island of Rhodes, a known center of astronomical study during this period and a plausible origin point for the ship's cargo before it sank en route toward Italy. This explanation is compelling and widely accepted among researchers studying the device. But it also underscores the size of the gap it's attempting to fill. If an entire tradition of comparably sophisticated mechanical devices once existed, why has virtually nothing else from that tradition survived in any form, anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world? No other fragments of comparable gearwork have been recovered from any other ancient shipwreck, structure, or workshop site excavated to date. No detailed ancient technical manual describing the construction of such a device has survived, assuming one was ever written down at all, rather than passed along through direct apprenticeship and hands-on craft tradition, the kind of knowledge transfer that leaves little to no archaeological trace once the chain of teaching is broken. That fragility is, perhaps, the central lesson embedded within the Antikythera mechanism's survival. Bronze, unlike stone, was a valuable, reusable material throughout antiquity, and countless ancient bronze objects, including devices potentially far more common than we now assume, were very likely melted down and repurposed over the centuries, their original form and function erased entirely, leaving no trace for future archaeologists to discover. The Antikythera mechanism survived specifically because it sank accidentally in a shipwreck, removing it from the ordinary cycle of reuse and recycling that eventually consumed most ancient metal objects. Its survival wasn't a reflection of it being uniquely important among ancient devices. It may simply reflect, once again, a familiar pattern we've now encountered repeatedly throughout this exploration. An object preserved by pure accident, offering us a narrow, precious window into a broader technological world that has otherwise almost entirely vanished. This raises, inevitably, one of the more genuinely open questions still surrounding the device. How many other Antikythera mechanisms once existed, built by skilled craftsmen working within a tradition we can now only partially reconstruct, and subsequently lost to melting, decay, or simple disposal once their function was no longer understood or valued by later owners? There remains, too, a smaller, more technical mystery still debated among researchers studying the mechanism's surviving fragments. Whether the 82 pieces recovered from the wreck represent the entirety of the original device, or only a portion of it. Some researchers have proposed the mechanism may have originally included additional dial functions not fully represented among the surviving fragments, potentially including a planetary display capable of modeling the movements of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn against the zodiac, based on gear ratios and inscription fragments that hint at, without conclusively confirming, this additional layer of astronomical complexity. If accurate, this would mean the device was even more sophisticated in its original complete form than what researchers have already been able to reconstruct from the surviving evidence. A genuinely staggering possibility that remains, for now, informed speculation rather than settled fact. There's also the matter of who, precisely, built it, and for whom. The device's inscriptions include references to a Greek calendar associated specifically with the region of Corinth and its colonies, including Syracuse, on the island of Sicily, leading some researchers to propose a connection to Archimedes himself, who lived and worked in Syracuse and was killed there in 212 BC during the Roman siege of the city, a period consistent with, though not definitively matching, the estimated construction date of the mechanism. Could the Antikythera mechanism represent a device built within a tradition Archimedes himself helped establish, whether directly through his own workshop or indirectly through students and successors who carried his mechanical innovations forward? It's a tantalizing possibility, actively discussed among researchers. But like so much surrounding this object, it remains firmly unconfirmed, resting on circumstantial rather than direct evidence. What isn't in question is the significance of what the device represents about ancient technological capability more broadly. For a long time, the popular understanding of ancient Greek science tended to emphasize theoretical achievement in mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, while assuming a comparatively limited capacity for translating that theory into complex, precision-engineered physical devices. The Antikythera mechanism dismantles that assumption entirely, providing direct physical proof that at least some segment of the ancient Greek world possessed both the theoretical astronomical knowledge and the practical mechanical engineering skill necessary to build a genuinely sophisticated analog computer over 2,000 years before the term computer would come to mean anything at all. Research into the device continues even now, more than a century after Valerio Stace first noticed a gear tooth embedded in a corroded lump of bronze. Each new generation of imaging technology has revealed further inscriptions, further mechanical detail, further confirmation of just how carefully and precisely this object was originally designed and constructed. And yet the largest questions, how widespread this level of mechanical sophistication truly was throughout the ancient world, who exactly built this particular device, and how much of this lost tradition might still exist, unrecognized, misidentified, or simply not yet found, remain genuinely open. Somewhere at the bottom of the Aegean, or perhaps in a museum storeroom somewhere in the world, catalogued under a far less remarkable description, there may be other fragments of this same lost tradition, waiting, much like the Antikythera mechanism itself once did, for someone to look closely enough at a shapeless piece of corroded bronze to notice, hidden within the corrosion, the faint outline of a gear tooth that shouldn't be there at all. The Antikythera mechanism reminded us that a single object can outlast an entire lost tradition of knowledge. High in the Ötzi Alps, straddling the modern border between Austria and Italy, another single object was about to do something similar. Not by demonstrating a forgotten mechanical sophistication, but by quietly rewriting what historians believed they understood about trade, metallurgy, and the movement of raw materials across Copper Age Europe. And once again, the discovery began not with careful excavation, but with a chance encounter that nearly ended in disaster for the object itself. In September of 1991, two German hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, were traversing a high mountain pass near the Similon Glacier at an elevation of roughly 3,200 meters when they spotted something unusual protruding from the melting ice. A human body, face down, remarkably preserved, still partially frozen into the surrounding glacier. Their first assumption, a reasonable one given the location, was that they had stumbled upon the remains of a modern mountaineer, perhaps someone lost in an accident decades earlier. Mountain rescue teams were called, and initial recovery efforts, understandably conducted with the assumptions appropriate to a recent death rather than an archaeological discovery, caused some damage to the body and surrounding site before its true age became apparent. It wasn't until the remains were examined more closely, and particularly once the copper axe found alongside the body was properly assessed, that the full significance of the discovery began to emerge. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was a man who had died and been preserved by ice, roughly 5,300 years ago, making him, at the time of his discovery, the oldest naturally mummified human body ever found in Europe, and one of the oldest anywhere in the world. He came to be known as Ötzi, named after the Ötzi Alps where he was discovered, and in the decades since that initial encounter on the mountainside, he has become one of the most extensively studied human beings, ancient or modern, in the history of science. Researchers have examined his stomach contents to reconstruct his final meals. They've studied his tattoos, his clothing, his DNA, and the arrowhead lodged in his shoulder that ultimately confirmed his death was violent rather than accidental. Ötzi has told us an extraordinary amount about daily life in Copper Age Europe, roughly 3300 BC, a period for which direct physical evidence of this quality is exceptionally rare. But among the many objects found with him, one in particular would go on to raise questions extending far beyond his own individual life and death. A small, T-shaped copper axe, its wooden handle remarkably intact, found near his body along with the rest of his equipment. At first glance, the axe might seem like a straightforward artifact, valuable simply for its age and completeness. Copper tools from this period are exceptionally rare finds, and one preserved with its original wooden haft still attached, the leather binding still visible, offered researchers an unprecedented opportunity to study Copper Age tool construction in complete functional detail, rather than reconstructing it from fragments. That alone would have made the axe archaeologically significant. What made it genuinely mysterious came later, once researchers applied modern analytical techniques to determine exactly where the copper itself had originated. Metal, unlike many other archaeological materials, carries a kind of geological fingerprint. The specific mixture of trace elements and isotopic ratios present within a piece of copper ore varies depending on the particular geological deposit it was extracted from, meaning that with sufficiently precise analysis, researchers can often trace a finished metal object back to the general region, and sometimes even the specific mine where its raw material originated. When researchers applied this kind of isotopic analysis to Ötzi's axe, expecting to confirm a local or at least regional alpine source consistent with where his body was found, the results were considerably more surprising. The copper used to make Ötzi's axe, researchers determined, hadn't come from anywhere near the Ötztal Alps at all. Its isotopic signature matched ore deposits from southern Tuscany, in central Italy, a region separated from where Ötzi died by hundreds of kilometers of genuinely difficult terrain, crossing multiple mountain ranges and significant geographic barriers that would have made travel between the two locations a substantial undertaking using the technology and transportation methods available during this period. This single finding quietly reshaped what researchers understood about Copper Age trade and metallurgical knowledge across this region of Europe. Prior to this discovery, and even with it, the general assumption regarding early Copper Age communities in the Alpine region held that metalworking knowledge and raw material acquisition were likely organized on a relatively localized, small-scale basis. Communities primarily using whatever ore sources happened to be reasonably accessible within their own immediate territory, with only limited long-distance exchange of finished metal goods, rather than the extraction and specific sourcing of raw ore itself across such considerable distances. The Tuscan origin of Ötzi's axe copper suggested something more organizationally complex. Either a trade network capable of moving raw or partially processed copper ore across genuinely significant distances, or alternatively, a degree of individual or small group mobility among Copper Age communities considerably greater than previously assumed, with people themselves, rather than simply finished trade goods, potentially traveling these considerable distances to access specific, apparently preferred, ore sources. Which raises the central question this discovery has left largely unresolved. How exactly did copper ore or copper metal from Tuscany end up in the hands of a man who lived and died hundreds of kilometers away in the Alps during a period when we have limited direct evidence of the kind of organized long-distance trade infrastructure that later periods of European prehistory would eventually develop? Several explanations have been proposed, none of them definitively confirmed, each carrying its own implications for how we understand this period. The most straightforward explanation treats this as evidence of an early, informal trade network. Copper moving from hand to hand, community to community, gradually traveling considerable distances not through any single organized trading expedition, but through a kind of cumulative incremental exchange between neighboring groups, each trading partner moving the material only a relatively modest distance before passing it further along the chain. Under this interpretation, no single individual or group necessarily needed to travel the full distance between Tuscany and the Ötztal Alps. The copper itself made the journey gradually, through a series of smaller regional exchanges, over what may have been a considerable period of time before finally arriving in the hands of whoever eventually crafted it into the axe found with Ötzi. This explanation fits reasonably well with broader archaeological evidence suggesting some degree of exchange and interaction between different Copper Age communities across this general region of Europe, evidence that includes similarities in certain tool types, and pottery styles found at sites separated by considerable distances, suggesting cultural contact and exchange of some kind, even if the specific mechanisms driving that exchange remain difficult to fully reconstruct from the archaeological record alone. But this explanation doesn't fully satisfy every aspect of what researchers have found, because it isn't only the axe's copper that points toward a Tuscan or broader Italian connection in Ötzi's life. Analysis of Ötzi's own body, including isotopic study of his tooth enamel, which preserves a chemical record of the water and food consumed during childhood, along with analysis of his lung tissue, which showed evidence consistent with exposure to copper smelting, suggested Ötzi himself may have spent significant portions of his life, including possibly his childhood, in a lower altitude region south of where he was ultimately found, an area consistent with parts of what is now northern or central Italy, rather than having lived his entire life within the higher alpine environment where his body was discovered. If Ötzi himself had personal connections to a region closer to the copper's actual source, this reframes the question considerably. Rather than the copper traveling to him through an extended trade network, it becomes plausible that Ötzi, or people closely connected to him, may have had direct personal familiarity with, or even direct access to, copper-producing regions considerably further south than where he ultimately died. Some researchers have proposed that Ötzi himself may have possessed genuine metalworking knowledge and experience, based partly on this lung tissue evidence suggesting direct exposure to the specific conditions associated with copper smelting, a technically demanding process requiring sustained, direct exposure to smoke and particulate matter of the kind his lungs appeared to show evidence of. This possibility transforms Ötzi, in some interpretations, from simply a man carrying a valuable, distantly sourced trade good into potentially a skilled craftsman himself, someone with direct personal knowledge of and access to the copperworking tradition that produced his axe, rather than someone who had simply acquired a finished tool through trade from more distant, specialized producers. We don't know with certainty which of these broader scenarios is correct, and it's entirely possible that some combination of both, trade networks and personal mobility working together, ultimately explains how this particular axe came to exist and to travel the distance it apparently did. What we do know is that the copper itself represents genuine physical evidence of connection and movement across a considerably wider geographic area than researchers had previously assumed was typical for individuals or communities living in this specific alpine region during this specific period. There's a further layer of technical sophistication embedded within the axe itself that deepens this broader mystery. Analysis of the copper's composition revealed it contained an unusually high level of arsenic, a detail that turns out to carry genuine metallurgical significance rather than representing simple, incidental impurity. Arsenic, when present within copper in the right proportions, has the effect of hardening the resulting metal considerably, producing what metallurgists refer to as arsenical copper or arsenical bronze, a material genuinely superior in hardness and durability compared to pure, unalloyed copper, though still generally softer and less durable than true tin bronze, which would eventually come to dominate metalworking in Europe during the following Bronze Age. The presence of this elevated arsenic content raises its own quiet question. Was this the deliberate result of intentional alloying? Metalworkers of this period possessing genuine transmittable knowledge regarding which specific ore sources produce naturally harder, more useful metal once smelted, and deliberately seeking out and utilizing those particular sources for this reason? Or does the arsenic content simply reflect the natural incidental composition of the specific Tuscan ore deposits being used during this period, with any resulting hardness benefit representing a fortunate accident of geology, rather than genuine metallurgical intent and understanding on the part of the people producing the metal? Researchers studying early European metallurgy remain divided on precisely how much deliberate technical understanding to attribute to Copper Age communities regarding these kinds of alloying effects. Some point to broader patterns across multiple archaeological sites from this general period, noting that arsenical copper appears with sufficient consistency across various early metal objects to suggest at least some degree of deliberate selection, communities gradually learning through practical experience which specific ore sources reliably produced superior, harder, finished metal, even without necessarily understanding the underlying chemistry driving that improvement in the way modern metallurgists would. Others argue the evidence remains genuinely ambiguous, and that attributing too much deliberate technical sophistication to this period risks overstating what the physical evidence alone can actually confirm. Either way, Ötzi's axe represents a genuinely early, technically competent example of exactly the kind of practical metallurgical knowledge that would, over the following centuries, eventually develop into the far more systematic, deliberate bronze alloying techniques that would come to define the subsequent Bronze Age across Europe. In this sense, the axe sits at a genuinely significant technological threshold, offering physical evidence of communities already experimenting with, and apparently benefiting from, alloying effects that full Bronze Age metallurgy would later formalize and deliberately exploit on a much larger, more systematic scale. There's also a broader social question embedded within this single small object, one that connects back to territory we've already explored earlier in this journey at Varna's Golden Graves. Copper during this period wasn't a common, easily accessible material. Its production required specialized knowledge, dedicated labor, and access to specific, geographically limited ore sources, meaning finished copper objects like Ötzi's axe likely represented genuine, significant value and status within Copper Age communities, an object considerably more valuable and difficult to obtain than the simple flint and stone tools that still made up the majority of Ötzi's broader equipment and toolkit. This raises a question about Ötzi's own social position that researchers have approached carefully, aware of how much remains genuinely uncertain about the broader social structures of Copper Age Alpine communities. Was Ötzi's possession of this valuable, seemingly distantly sourced copper axe evidence of some degree of elevated personal status, whether through wealth, specialized skill, or particular social role within his community? Or does it simply reflect that copper tools, however valuable, had become sufficiently integrated into the practical, everyday equipment of at least some individuals within Copper Age Alpine society by this period, without necessarily indicating any especially elevated personal status on Ötzi's specific part? The broader context of Ötzi's death and the equipment found with him offers some additional, if still incomplete, insight into this question. Ötzi died violently, killed by an arrow that struck his shoulder, likely leading to fatal blood loss, following what appears to have been some kind of sustained physical conflict, evidenced by additional wounds and defensive injuries found on his body, along with traces of blood from multiple other individuals found on his weapons and clothing, suggesting he may have been involved in violence with several different people, potentially across more than one separate confrontation, in the period shortly before his death. Rather than dying peacefully or through simple accident or exposure, Ötzi appears to have been actively fleeing or fighting in the period immediately preceding his death, high in the mountains, ultimately succumbing to his injuries in a location that, whether through his own experienced route across dangerous, challenging alpine terrain, or simple survival desperation, still required a level of environmental knowledge and hardiness suggesting he was, at minimum, someone genuinely familiar and comfortable navigating this demanding mountain environment. If Ötzi was fleeing conflict when he died, carrying his most valuable equipment, including this apparently distantly sourced copper axe, with him, it raises the possibility that his final journey may have interrupted or been directly connected to whatever broader trade, craft, or personal circumstances had originally brought this specific piece of Tuscan copper into his possession in the first place. We simply don't have enough evidence to reconstruct the specific circumstances of the conflict that led to his death, including whether it connected in any direct way to the valuable metal object he was carrying, or represented an entirely separate, unrelated dispute. What remains in the end is the axe itself, a small, unassuming tool, its wooden handle remarkably preserved by over 5,000 years of alpine ice, its copper blade carrying within its own chemical composition a genuine physical record of connection and movement across a considerable stretch of ancient Europe that researchers are still working to fully understand and reconstruct. Like the Griffin warrior's tiny carved agate, like the gold of Varna, like the gears of the Antikythera mechanism, Ötzi's axe demonstrates, in its own quiet way, a pattern we've now encountered repeatedly throughout this exploration. Ancient peoples, in specific circumstances and specific locations, achieving a level of technical sophistication, geographic connection, or organizational complexity considerably greater than older historical assumptions had generally allowed for, evidence surviving now largely through fortunate accidents of preservation rather than any deliberate historical record. Research into Ötzi and his equipment continues even now, more than 3 decades after his initial discovery, with researchers periodically returning to re-examine his remains and belongings, using whatever new analytical technology has become available since the previous round of study, much as researchers did with the Antikythera mechanism across successive generations of imaging technology. Each new examination has tended to reveal further detail, further nuance, further complexity in what initially appeared to be a relatively straightforward, if remarkably well-preserved, ancient death. But the central question surrounding his axe, exactly how its Tuscan copper made the journey to the man who carried it, whether through extended trade networks, personal mobility, or some combination of both, and exactly how much deliberate metallurgical knowledge and understanding lay behind its particular composition, remain genuinely open, informed by considerable evidence but not yet definitively resolved by it. Somewhere in the centuries between the mining of that Tuscan copper ore and its final resting place beside a dying man high in the Ötztal Alps, there's a story of movement, exchange, and specialized knowledge that we can currently only partially reconstruct, glimpsed through isotopic analysis and careful chemical study rather than through any direct written or oral account that might once have explained it clearly and completely. Ötzi himself, preserved so remarkably by the ice that took his life, has already told researchers an extraordinary amount about his own final days, his health, his diet, and the manner of his death. But the small copper axe found beside him continues to hold onto a piece of the story even he, if we could somehow ask him directly, might not have fully understood himself. The complete, specific history of exactly how this particular hardened piece of Tuscan metal, shaped into a tool by hands whose names and specific techniques are lost to us now, came to travel so far, into the mountains, into the ice. And finally, after 5,000 years, back into our own hands.